What's up, guys? So, of course, like anything today, I'm going to give you 5 tips on how to play Legend of Mushroom. More specifically, I'm going to give you some advice. So, a lot of people, what they'll do is they'll do a filter on the 2 stats that they want, and they'll run it through. Problem with this approach is that you'll tend to find that you're not going to have enough lamps. And you'll run through a bunch of lamps trying to get a high quality item, and I'll show you the difference, okay? If I set it to normal and above, you'll notice that, oh, hey, what do you know? I can hit combo and crit like that, like crazy all the time, right? But again, the biggest downside is you're getting rid of HP, attack, defense, and attack speed, depending on the version that you get, right? But you're going to ultimately gain the stats that you're aiming to acquire. And sometimes when you're wanting to build, like, say, a specific type of build, what I recommend you do is actually go out and you can create another set. So, for example, let's say I'm working on my second set. And, like right now it's set to PAL combo and crit rate. Let's say, for example, if right now we want to work on, say, the new PAL class that's coming out. Okay, one of the things that you'll want is crit rate and then PAL crit. I would argue these are the two that make the most sense, because having a high PAL crit can be pretty advantageous. Now, the problem is a lot of the time people want PAL combo. And you can go PAL combo in your gear and then get PAL crit somewhere else. And ultimately, you're kind of doing the same thing that you would do if, let's say, you wanted to do PAL crit and PAL combo together, right? And I can kind of show you like a set that I built not that long ago, just for the funsies. Okay, of where basically all I have in my set is a combination of PAL crit. But you notice how I've always got 1 or extra 2 stats. And the problem with doing that is you tend to find that you're not going to be as efficient in terms of what your build is. So, like, for example, if I've got PAL and PAL crit and I just hit start, basically what you can do is you can go out and, say, pick out the pieces of gear that maybe, don't quite have what you're after. So I recommend, instead of going like on normal, for example, like here I'm going after Aurus pieces and stuff, go up to like Immortal, for example. And even when you do land on it, it's not going to be like outrageously below your stats, but it all depends on like where you are in the game too. I mean, in my case, I'm way up there at this point. So for me, it's absolutely nothing to burn through 20,000 lamps, like nothing. And it won't bother me a bit, because trying to get Immortal pieces, Aurus pieces, and Eternal Gear pieces all the way up is a challenge, to say the least. Now, that, as far as I'm concerned, is the way you should probably approach this whenever you're trying to get those specific stats in your build. And again, knowing what advanced attributes you're aiming for is ultimately the big key. Like in the new class for Beast Tamer or for the Spirit Channeler, most of your effort is going to be spent, I think, really going to be, you're going to increase your PAL damage, and then you're going to be working on the individual PAL combo and PAL crit, which you can find in here. And you're going to increase your crit damage, you're going to increase the amount of PAL combo you do, because the more combos that you can fire off, the more crit that you can fire off with your PALs, the more damage you're going to be able to do. But on the same token, what about your main character? What stat are you going to work on there? And this is something that I feel like in a way you can kind of experiment with. A lot of the builds that I see kind of invoke having Counter-Strike. So, for example, like maybe instead of going for PAL combo and PAL crit, you go for Counter-Strike and PAL combo. Yeah, and that might be more advantageous for a lot of players. Because what you'll tend to find is that if your character is all basically getting hit at, it makes more sense for you to be able to do counter. Now, I point this out because if you look at like how, say, like an Expo, for example, is running combo, okay, they're getting combo bonuses like crazy on the info tab. It'll tell you almost right out of the gate, right? But if you look at, like, say, the Supreme Spirit, okay, you'll notice that the info is in the cycles of life and seasons, only death lasts for eternity. It's not as like straightforward, and you can look at it and be a little bit puzzled as to like what exactly are you supposed to do. The same is also true of the info tab here. But you'll notice that like most of the damage that is done here, okay, is increasing PAL crit, it's increasing PAL base attack speed, and the amount of damage done, and it's ultimately aiming to do a lot of damage by increasing the amount of PAL damage you're doing, okay? Whereas, like, a lot of the other classes may benefit from, say, like, you know, in the case of, like, Dark Lord, it's ultimately going for skill crit, and in the case of, like, say, a Sacred Hunter, you know, they're looking more or less, there's a fair bit of damage being done in crit damage for them, because they get a little bit of a bonus every time they crit, you know, and it's just kind of a different playstyle, you know. It's like Warbringers, for example, they benefit a lot from having counter damage in there. And you can see why. They're getting a bonus for every counter they're doing. You know, so I point out counters, though, because you got to think in terms of, you know, okay, what's this individual character going to really be doing? You know, if all you gain from different deploy effects, for example, in the spirit, you know, the supreme spirit for that matter, and it's going to be dependent on what pals you're using and which combinations you decide to use. But like if I use the current combination I have now, I'm basically increasing pal crit and pal combo. Was the way I like to go about it. You know, but you could also just as easily go down the Beastmaster route, and there's still not any harm in going this route. It's really pretty similar. The only difference really is that you don't get the deploy effect bonuses, which at times can be kind of disadvantageous if you're wanting to run like something that's a little tankier, for example. You know, but again, I point this out because you can see how we've been doing this for like the last 5 minutes, and yet we get hardly anything. And that's the problem a lot of the time, is that you're not going to fire, you know, it's actually incredibly rare for you to get 2 stats that you're looking for in an Oris or Eternal piece of gear. It's not an easy task at all. And sometimes what you do is you wind up trading off for one or the other, you know. And so whenever you look at like a lot of my build pieces and combo gear, for example, I don't stress having the correct stats. I just pick one stat and hope that I get that right. You know, so in the case of, you know, my Expo, I mean, in my case, I don't really care so much what it is, as long as it has combo. And then, of course, like, that's where you get a little bit more picky. You go, okay, well, I want it Eternal, but I don't really care if it's, you know, as long as it's got combo in it, I'll take it. And that, to me, I think is a better use of, you know, if you're trying to level your gear, that, to me, makes the most sense. But I've seen people approach it differently. You know, you can just as easily approach this as, instead of going for quality Eternal gear, go for Supreme and above and have the 2 stats that you're after. You know, you can nitpick it however you want to nitpick it, but that, in my opinion, when it comes to lamp spending, that's the way I would do it. Now, that's all for one tip. Now, my second tip is with regards to Avens, okay? You've got a lot of different choices here, but I would say Sunshine Bringer is going to be like best in slot, I think, for your, you know, your Expo players, just because you're basically getting some AoE DMG there, plus you're getting a duration of control received by 15% reduced. That's going to be helpful because there's a lot of stuns and reductions there that are out to pretty much screw you. Now, it's not to say that you can't use like Anubis, because Anubis is really good in terms of what you're going to gain in terms of not only the flat like skill damage, combo damage, and counter damage bonuses, but it also reduces their attack by 15%. And so for anybody that's trying to reduce attack against other players in PvP, that can be helpful. I mean, Midnight Firefly approaches this just a little bit differently, where it's reducing the target's damage resistance by 15%. You know, again, similar idea, but this makes it where you can actually kill them a little faster. If you get like Moonbound Spirit, for example, then, you know, here you have a chance to deal 3% more to target's max HP. This is kind of an interesting ploy. Like, it's both good and bad. I don't find that Moonbound is really helpful for many classes, except for those of you out there that are wanting to. I mean, if anything, this is probably more helpful in PvE because you're doing an enormous amount of damage to things that are bosses and stuff like that. That's really where I think Moonbound shines. Now, if you look at, like, say, the Impulse Penguin, that's basically the counter damage de la creme, because you're going to get a stupid amount after, 10 seconds. You're going to stack it up to 5 times, so you're going to get a fair bit. Plus, you can also get a lot of different counter-related passives, and that's going to give you a huge advantage. Now, your Prophets and stuff like that, your even Dark Lords are probably going to run Dense Cloud just because it runs the frequency of your energy regen, which basically makes it easier for you to fire off skills. 3-round shooter's good for, like, when you're starting out in your combo build, because this is just going to give you that much more damage on top of your combos. Honeypot Warrior is, again, kind of the back to the bosses type class, and then you got skill crit, and you've got, every crit, you do AoE bleed damage, and there's different AoE bleeds that are out there. Now, like, in the case of anybody running the new class, like Supreme Spirit or Beastmaster, you're going to want Yogurt Champ. But again, with regards to avians, pick the avian that works best, that suits the type of class that you're benefiting for. And therefore, that means, if you're going counter and you're Warbringer, get a counter avian. If you're going combo, get a combo avian. And this is also true of artifacts, as it is also mounts, that you oftentimes will want to reflect pieces of gear that will effectively bonus increase the amount of combo damage you do if you're an Expo player, or the amount of crit you do if you're a Sacred Hunter, but counter damage in the case of, Warbringer, or, even damage resistance in the case of the Martial Sage. The principle in all the different classes is just the different stats that you can bonus, right? I mean, outside of that, my third tip would be is, if you haven't already, make sure that you are saving your Lucky Spinner tokens, because again, you can turn around and you can save those for the next event. So that's a big thing. Otherwise, my fourth tip would be that if you are ever running the events, you always want to look out for Fortune Cap. And if Fortune Cap comes by, you can actually save a fair bit of money by buying through the diamonds method of getting tokens in the game. And you can also save some money with the Aptoid, which will be down in the description below, and a tutorial on how to use it at the end of the video. But that's another big thing too, is if you do seriously consider spending in the game, that's one thing you want to look out for. My fifth and final tip is that when you are out picking out skills, all right, you want to make sure that you pay very, very close attention to cross-server showdown as well as parking wars. You always want to run something in your park, and I recommend going for the highest possible coin driven. So the top parking coins is the one I pay the most attention to, because you want to run anything higher than 50%, and that's ideal because you don't have to park at a public server spot when you do find somebody that has this, and that gives you at least the kind of the less likelihood that you're going to need to deal with other players that are going to rob you of what you've got for parking. So other than that, I mean, the main thing I'm getting at here is that you can use those then to basically buy a Dark Trials card, which you'll want because you're going to need to basically go out and do an extra, and this is like one of those things that I think I could swear up and down by, but you always want to run your Dark Trials as much as you can. Try to unlock and challenge them all the way through, because it really does make a huge difference if you've got a really decent high level in your back accessory talents. So make sure you're doing that. But needless to say, those are my 5 tips for Legend of Mushroom. I mean, if anything, if you want to know more about like what is really strictly important, I would say make sure you're doing your dormitory, do your mine, go to host and get married, and actually do your cooperation tests and such once you've gotten married, because you can turn around and basically use that to upgrade your ring, which is going to give you more stats. Obviously do your tech park. I recommend trying to keep these even because you don't want to like try to go too far. Obviously I went a little ways into attack just to kind of increase my attack, but in general you want to go even. Prayer statue, like anything, is going to be really dependent on what class you're playing, but if you're like a plume monarch like me, then you're going all combo damage. You know, the same way that if you're going to play a Warbringer or a Sage, chances are you're all counter damage. And if you're a Prophet, it's more than likely all skill damage. And in the case of, like, say, playing the Beastmaster class or the Supreme Spirit, it's probably all PAL damage. Okay? That is not to say you can't use global attack and mix it up, you know, however you like in your build. But like anything, guys, you know, if you're going to go heavy crit damage, for example, I would assume you might be a Sacred Hunter. But like here, you know, lucky us, we have the choice between combo and crit, so we'll go ahead and take it for the extra stats, and that's going to give us just that much more combo. But like anything, you always want to have a really high combo and a really high crit rate. You don't necessarily want to have one or the other. You don't want to have like a full 100% into any one stat, because in the case of most of these classes, you can crit many times on a combo. And one thing that a lot of people don't understand is that, like, evasion, for example, only applies to basic attacks. It does not apply to, like, your combos, your counters, and your skill damage, you know? So you don't necessarily have any advantage of getting around evasion, per se. And this is why whenever you look at, like, your PALs, the ignore evasion is really critical, and the PAL damage resistance being dropped is pretty critical, because that's what makes those classes work. But I point out also that in cross-server showdown in particular, that you want to save your tokens and make sure you're grabbing your, you know, you want to grab random red soul selection 2 on your, you know, kind of like in the event. So this is 1, you don't want that. But, you know, if you want individual skills like Ancestral Will, that's where you get that. Otherwise, you would go to the Family Brawl, go to the exchange, and then you'll grab Draconic Resonance, for example, or Winged Dreams, for example, if you're aiming for that. And again, don't bother with the Red Soul Selection 1s. You almost rarely ever need those. If anything, what you'll end up doing is actually going to Cross Server Showdown, and this is where you get Red Soul Selection 2. Okay? Yeah, I keep saying the wrong one. Cross Server Ranked Matches, my bad. But this is where your Red Soul Selection 2s are. And you need those, as well as Awakening Crystals if you haven't already awakened. But needless to say, that is everything in regards to Legend of Mushroom that I have for you. Make sure to watch this part of the video if you'd like to learn how to save some money along the way.